Now, it goes well beyond that. What we essentially need to do is we need to set it up so that we have entire state machines that kind of run within this. I know this is going to sound like I'm a little bit, I'm going through things very quickly, but I assure you it'll make sense in just a moment. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to figure out what to plug into this animation pose. I'm going to right click and I'm going to type in the word state machine. And you'll see that we have add new state machine. Okay? So when we have a state machine, I'm going to hit F2 and I'm just going to call this locomotion. I'm then going to plug this into the result. And I'm then going to double click on locomotion. Now, how a state machine works is it lets us set up basic animations that should play at certain times and set up the rules that are required to switch between those animations. What I mean is that if I get my entry and I drag off of this, I can add a state. And let's say this first state is called movement. Now, whenever I'm in the movement state, I have the ability to jump. So whenever I want to jump, we're going to go add state, and we're going to have what's called the jump start state. And that's going to be that section of the jump where you kind of like start tensing your legs and start going up into the air. We then have the jump mid state. So I'm going to add another state, and this is going to be called jump mid. Now, if I were to have a jump mid state, it would be the section where I'm kind of like flailing my arms in the air and just falling. And finally, we would have another state which represents the landing state. Okay? Now the landing state is then going to plug straight back into movement, and I would be able to land and go back into an idle or a movement position. So that's how a state machine would work, and you'll notice that on each of these I have this little section that highlights itself. Do you see this little node? This represents the transition, and these can be one-way or two-way. For instance, if there was some way to go from jump state back into movement, I could have the jump state connecting back to it that way. So I've plugged this in, but I actually don't want that, so I'm going to delete that one. So it's all one way and we go around. But let's first look at what the movement state is. So I'm going to double click on that. Essentially, when we're in the movement state, which is our very first state, we're going to have something plugging into this. So this is going to be what we do whenever we're in the movement state. Now, if you think about what happens when we move, we essentially have a situation where we have to calculate how fast we're moving forwards or how fast we're moving to the side, and then blend animations of our forward running cycle with our strafing running cycles and work out what the final blend would look like. And what I mean by that is, imagine from a top-down perspective someone running forwards, okay? Now, if you wanted them to run forwards and to the right, you wouldn't want to have to make an animation that was both of those things. Okay? What you would want to do is create an animation for forwards and an animation for right, and let the game work out how to blend those two animations together. So how do we do that? And the answer is we create blend spaces. So I'm going to go to my content browser, and I'm going to create a blend space. And I know this is going into the deep end with animation quite quickly, but I promise you this will make sense reasonably quickly. So I'm just going to add a new blend space, and it's going to be based on my night girl, and it's going to be called movement blend space. Now I want you to double click on that blend space, because what we're going to be doing is setting up some movement for the character so that she can blend between different animations. So to do this, what we need to do is we need to set up points within her within this graph. So we have an X and we have a Y category. Well, what we want to do is we want to label this so that the X-axis is called right movement. And I want this to be between -200 and 200. Now my Y-axis label is going to be called forward movement. And it's going to be between, you guessed it, -200 and 200. I'm also going to set the number of divisions as 8 for both of these and hit apply. And you'll now see that this is forward movement and this is right movement. So keep in mind that negative right movement is left movement and negative forward movement is backwards movement. Okay? So what we do from here is we simply drop in the correct animation that should apply to the amount of that thing that you're doing at any one stage. So what I mean by that is, let's say I'm moving forward at full speed, so at 200 units per second. If that were the case, I would be doing a sprint. So I'm going to drag in the sprint node and pop it right there. Okay? So you can see that she's going to be doing that up there. Now we only have one node on its lonesome right now, so let's add a little bit more. Next I'm going to add an idle movement. Okay? So I'm going to go to here and I'm going to look for the idle animation. Idle, relaxed. And I'm just going to drop that in. And now, if we were to blend between these, you would notice that, oh, that was a good trick. So at the moment when I managed to swap those two nodes around somehow. So I'm just going to drag that to there. Somehow I managed to drop my sprint node down there and my idle up top. But that's okay. So when I'm at 0 movement, I'm this, and then as I start moving forward, it's going to start blending between those until I'm at full sprint. Do you see that? But the truth is that halfway is not going to be full sprint. Halfway is going to be the regular run forward. So to do that, I do forward movement, and you'll notice that we have player run forward. So I'm going to drag that in, and I'm going to connect that to about the 1 meter mark. So between here and here, and then between run and sprint. So see how now she'll like pitch herself forward depending? But we can do much more than this. Let's now set up the sideways running movements. So to do that, what I need to do is I'm going to add run right. And I'm going to drop that here. There we go. Run right. And the next thing I'm going to do is add the opposite to that, which is going to be run left. Does that make sense? We're going to now have backwards. So run backward is going to be all the way down here. Okay. And the other thing I'm going to do is if we're angling while running forward, I actually want to add an extra blend that's going to be run right and run left, just up to there. So I'm going to get run right and put it here, and the left and put it up here. And it might look a little odd here, so potentially I might want to actually move it back to about there. But I'm sure we can work out where that would be in a little bit. So I'm just grabbing these and kind of dropping them down. So full sprint would mean that I was here, and as I moved across, she would start angling her legs a little bit to the left and right. Okay? So that's our blend space, and I'm now going to go back to my blueprint. And for this animation, I'm just simply going to add the movement blend space that we just created, blend space player. And when I plug this in, it's going to say to me, there we go, compile, save. Now it's going to say, well, what's your right movement and what's your forward movement? So we need to work out how we want to get that. Now this is where the event graph comes in. So essentially what we're going to be doing is we can create variables that are stored in our animation blueprint. Okay? So to do that, all I need to do is go to the event graph and set up a variable down here. And this first variable that we create is just going to be called local velocity. And I'm going to set it to a vector. Now, much like a normal blueprint that has tick, we're going to use update animation in an MVP. And all we do here is very simple. We go check the animation and see if there is a pawn that owns it. And if there is, so drag off that. I'm going to check if it's valid. If there is a pawn, what we want to do is get its velocity and set it to something. Now, if I was to get the pawn and I was to get the velocity of it, this is unfortunately not going to be in local space. It'll be in world space. So what I need to do is translate this from being where it's moving in the world to its forward and right speeds. Okay? And to do that, I need to run an inverse transform direction, which we used before in that force movement volume, you may remember. And finally, I need to just plug into this a transform of the pawn. So I'm going to get this, I'm going to type in transform, and I'm going to get the actor's transform and just plug that straight into here. I'm then going to plug this into local velocity, and that's all you need. Compile, save. So that's set up. If you're wondering what these compiler errors are, it's because it doesn't know how to do any jumping or anything like that right now. We'll cover that in just a bit. So, movement blend space, I'm going to get my local velocity. I'm going to split the pin. Now X is forward, Y is sideways, so I'm simply just going to plug this into right movement and forward movement. Now if we wanted to test this, we can actually just punch in numbers ourselves. So I can click on the variable and say, hey, it's moving at 200 and see what it looks like. 100, 0. But we can do better than that. Compile, save. I'm going to go back to locomotion. This is all set up. So I'm going to go back to my anim graph and make sure that's also set up. It's definitely plugged in, which means, in theory, if I was to go to my controller, which is character base, sorry, not my controller, my character, and I was to set the character movement, sorry, the mesh animation blueprint to be my night girl. So I'm in character base, animation blueprint, night girl, compile, save, and then I was to hit play and watch her. She's now going to run. And if she were to strafe, she would correctly strafe. So that's the basics of getting the initial section of movement going. Simple, huh? So next up, we're going to expand on this system and add the jump cycle in there. As well as that, we're then going to move into some more interesting animations. So now that we've created the movement animation, I'm going to go through and show you how we would set up the jump animations. Now be aware that when we set this up, we're not actually going to be able to test it, unfortunately, because we haven't set up the player to jump just yet. But it does mean that when we get around to creating a player controller, we're going to be able to jump without any fuss. So I want to explain how this works. If I was to double click on the transition rule between movement and jump start, what I would see is this. Can enter transition. Now if this is equal to true, that means that the second that's equal to true, this is going to jump into the jump start state. Okay, so how do I do that? It's rather simple. I set up a rule here that tries to get the pawn owner. If it can get the pawn owner, then we're going to say we're going to get the movement component of the pawn, and when they're going to ask the movement component, hey, is the player falling? And if that's true, we can enter the jump state. Okay? Now, when we enter the jump state, what do we do? That's simple. When we enter the jump state, we want to play an animation for the player to begin jumping. Okay? So all I need to do here is I need to go to the asset browser, type in jump, and I can see that there's a couple of these here. The one I'm going to go with is going to be jump forward. If I plug this in the situation where we were jumping, this animation would now play. So next up, what I'm going to do is say, okay, so that's how we start the jump. But how do we get into the mid-air jump? Well, that's rather simple. To transition between jump start and jump mid, all I need to do is, if I type in get relevant. See, if I type in get relev, we have get relevant anim length, get relevant anim time, fraction remaining. Now what this lets me do is look at an animation that I've set to play anywhere in my graph. And if it's currently playing, I can return the value that says how long is it until it's finished. And if it's nearly finished the jump intro animation, so if this is less than or equal to, say, 0.1, then we can enter into the transition to do the next section, which is going to be the mid jump. So when we're in the jump mid, all I have to do is plug in the falling animation. So the falling animation is If I highlight this, you can see it. It's just her doing that. So I'm going to plug that in. I'm then going to go back. And for me to go from jump mid to the landing animation, I then need to check, well, are we still falling or not? So if you think about how we go from movement to jump start, I'm doing a check to say, check if the pawn is falling. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go to my jump mid to landing, and all I'm going to say here is rather simple. If this is not true, not that, we can now go into the movement state. And that's all it takes for us to go into the landing state. So to go into the landing state, we're then going to play another animation, which in here is called land. Oops. And again, you can see it kind of playing there. It's as she hits the ground, her knees kind of buckle a bit. Compile, save. And finally, for us to go from landing to movement, all I really need to do here is check if the landing animation is finished. So if the landing animation is finished, which is time remaining for the player land, if this is, I don't know, let's go less than or equal to, let's do 0.1 again. And that's all it takes to add in the functionality to cycle between a bunch of animations and end up in the movement state again. So that's it for going through the basic locomotion chain. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a little function that is going to make our character look a bit strange, but it's just going to make the character jump every now and then, because if they jump, you'll be able to see what's happening. Okay? So if I go to my controller base, and I say set timer by event every 7 seconds, I'm going to want to get my controlled pawn, and I'm going to do, if I was to get this. Now, we can't just get a pawn and call jump, and the reason for that is what I would need to do is I would need to create a new event that's just going to be called force jump. Plug this into here, and in much the same way as before, where I got the controlled pawn, I checked if that was valid. I then cast it to a character. Again, we're going to see if that's valid. I'm then going to get this and call jump, and that works because a pawn doesn't have the function jump in it, but a character does. Okay, and I've set this to every 7 seconds. So if we were to hit play and watch her, it's good timing. There you go. So she did a little jump there. She doesn't quite know why she's jumping. So there you go. See how she jumped up and played the animation correctly. There we go. So she's cycling through the animations, and we now definitely know it's working. I'm going to go back into my controller base and just delete this last little forced jump business, because we don't want to do that. Compile, save. So we've now got a character that is capable of more advanced locomotion. So from here, we now need to go ahead and start creating some actual player input. Coming up next. So we have the basics of an enemy in, but let's start getting ourselves a player controller together. So I'm going to go to my content browser, blueprints. I'm going to right click and create a new blueprint class, and this is going to be a player controller class. And I'm going to call this, you guessed it, KG player controller base. So let's double click on this KG player controller base and see what we have inside of it. Okay, now I'm going to be using this on my Night Girl, and it's going to be handling all of the brain and input stuff. Now, the truth is there's very little that I actually need to do as far as the brain is concerned for the player, for the most part anyway. However, there is one big thing that we do need to consider, which is that at all times I want my character to face where my mouse is looking. So I'm going to make an event that's going to be a custom event, and I'm going to call it process mouse. Now for process mouse, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this most likely every tick, but if we ever switch over to using joypad controls, we're not going to. So for the time being, tick is going to call process mouse, and all this means is if process mouse, when it runs, it's going to say, okay, get the hit result under cursor by channel. What that means is we're going to look at where the mouse currently is, and we're going to find out what's underneath it. So when we get the hit result, what we want to do is we want to get that, and we want to go, well, this return value is true. If it hits something, so if there is something under my mouse and not just like an empty void, then what I want to do is I want to set the rotation of my control pawn. So I'm going to get the control pawn, and I'm just going to set the actor rotation. So if that's true, I'm going to set the actor's rotation. Now, what that means is I need to do one other thing. That is, before I call process mouse, I'm going to double check that I even have a pawn in my possession. Somehow, if I don't, things could go badly. So I'm going to say if this is valid, so if the controlled pawn is a valid thing and we have one, process this. So we're going to be setting the rotation of the controlled pawn, but how do we set their rotation? That's easy. How we do it is we get the hit result and then we break it, which gives us all of the variables inside of it. Now, from the hit result, we get this piece of information called location, which is the position in the world that our mouse traced down to. So I'm going to get the location, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the direction between myself and that position. So to do that, what I need to do is from the location, I'm going to go get unit direction. So this gets me the direction from the location, and I need to get the direction from me to it. So even though I dragged off of it, I actually want this to be in the to category, because the from section is going to be the location of the controlled pawn. So we're going to find the direction from me to the it. Now I'm then going to just simply plug this into rotation from x vector, which converts this into a rotation. And then I'm just going to plug this into here. Now there are a few issues with what I've just done, but this will work temporarily. I'm going to hit compile and I'm going to hit save. And there is something else I'm going to need to do before I continue. And what that is I'm going to need to go to my character, and I'm actually going to need to set them up with a camera, because this is my character right now, right? But if you think about it, my character needs to actually have somewhere for my camera to be when I'm controlling them. So to do that, what I'm going to do is, first off, I'm going to add a spring arm. Now a spring arm is essentially this red line that you can see here. It's a thing for us to put the camera on the end of, and at all times the spring arm checks to see if there's any objects between it and the camera. And if there is, it'll shrink itself down or expand itself out. So a spring arm is very, very useful. Now, I've added a spring arm, so the next thing I'm going to do is add a camera. Now, when I add the camera, you'll notice that spring arm allows me to actually put this, oh, hang on, I've just got to parent it to the spring arm. There we go. So you can see here that the camera is now at the end of the spring arm. So with that done, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to set this up to have the spring arm facing upwards. So I'm going to rotate this, and I'm going to position it here. Now, it's up to us how long we want the arm to be. My gut says 600 units is probably pretty good. If we want to, we could zoom out a little further and go 700. Up to you. You can also put it at a slight angle if you choose to. At the moment, I've got this set to here, but it's up to you. So we've got the character set up there, and the next thing that I'm going to do is, at the moment, the spring arm inherits the pitch, yaw, and roll from the character. but I don't want to do that. I want my up to always be up, regardless of which way the character's facing. So I'm going to check all of those. And finally, you'll see that you have this little section here called Enable Camera Lag. I highly recommend you turn this on. This just means that when the character starts moving, it's going to have a little bit of drift on the camera and not feel super jerky. So it's a pretty good feeling to have that in there. So now with that set, we've got all of the basics for the camera set up. Going to compile and save. And then finally, what I need to do is actually test what I've done. So to do that, I'm going to need to go ahead and create a base player controller game mode. Sorry, a base game mode that sets the player controller. So to do that, I just right click, new blueprint, game mode base, and this is just going to be called KG game mode. And the KG game mode is going to say the default player controller class is KG player controller, default pawn class is the KG character base. Everything else can stay as it is for the time being. Compile save. So if I were to get into this now, I'm going to double check that there's not a player start. Yeah, there is. So there is already a player start in the world all the way over here. I'm going to get this player start and I'm actually going to place this in my map. And I'm going to hit play. Now, the thing that I need to do after I add it is in maps and modes, I need to tell it to use KG game mode. So I've set that up now, and this time when I hit play, you'll see we're here. Now, if you look closely, you can see as I rotate the mouse, we now have a character who's actually rotating to face my mouse. She doesn't have anything else going for her, and if I do this, she does that. But, you know, it's a start. So the first issue is that when I rotate my character like that, I'm currently setting her X, Y, and Z rotation. But if you think about it, the only actual rotation that I really want to change is her yaw. So I only want her spinning on the spot. I don't want her doing anything else. So if I want to, I could split this, and then just connect yaw to each other and ignore the rest. And you'll see that she's now rotating to face the mouse. And everything is good. Now, the next issue is that when I left click, did you see what happened? My mouse disappeared. Now the reason my mouse disappeared is that currently my player hasn't actually been told to show the mouse. So I need to actually set up the game such that when the player is playing the game, that the mouse is visible. Now that's a really easy thing to do. I'm just going to go back to my player controller, and on begin play, I'm going to type show mouse. And I'm going to check that so that it's true. Compile, save, play. There you go. My mouse no longer disappears. Fantastic. So next up, we're going to be doing the movement inputs so that my player can actually run around. One thing I do want to flag with you is this functionality that we have in here at the moment works, but it is instantaneous. So it is always facing my mouse, and there's no like delay at all, rotation rate. That is something that we can set up, but I'm going to be setting it up later. In the meantime, stick around for the input tutorials. So now we have the basics of how to rotate our player to the mouse. What we're going to do from here is we're going to set them up so that we can actually move around using either a gamepad or WASD. Now in this situation, what I need to do is go to my project settings, which is under Edit, Project Settings, and then go down to Input. From within Input, you'll see that we have action mappings and axis mappings. And much like the previous project, we're going to be looking at why we want to add it to a specific category. In this situation, we want to do an axis mapping because we're basing it around movement. And I'll show you why. So add an axis mapping. And I'm going to set this to be called up. And initially, I'm going to make the up to be set to W. Now this is going to have a scale of 1. And the reason for that is I'm going to add another one, which is going to be S, which we're going to use for down. And the reason we're adding the downwards movement to the up axes is because down is actually upwards in a negative direction. So the scale is going to be -1. So that way they're working on the same axes but going different directions. And the cool part of this is, in theory, if you wanted to add joystick support, you would actually only need to have a gamepad left thumbstick y-axis, and it would automatically read in the scale according to which direction the thumbstick was facing. So the y-axis refers to the up and down on the thumbstick. Now in this situation I'm going to add another axis mapping, which is going to be referred to as right, and I'm going to make this bound to D. And as you may have already guessed, we're going to be binding A to be negative right. So left is the opposite of right. So I've gone A, and I'm setting the scale to be -1. Now again, if you wanted to add gamepad support, all you would need to do would be gamepad left thumbstick x-axis, and that's all you would have to do, and that would now support it on that section. So we've added that. Now let's open up our player controller. So within the player controller, we're going to be setting up the binds, and as I mentioned earlier, the player controller is essentially the brain passing information to the pawn, which is the body. So in this situation, what we're going to do is we're going to right click, and we're going to go input up, and you'll see that we have axis events input up. So I'm going to get this, and what I'm going to do is, first off, I'm going to add the ability to move the pawn. So I'm going to get my pawn by doing get controlled pawn. And I'm quickly going to check if that's valid or not. So I'm just seeing, do I actually have a body? And if I do, so if the is valid is true, I'm going to then go ahead and do add movement input, which means we're going to tell the pawn to move in a specific direction. But you've got to think about this. Which direction do we actually want to move them? Well, we want to move up to be upwards relative to the camera, which means that if we go ahead and we get the camera, so we can actually get the camera by getting get player camera manager within the player controller down the bottom here. Be careful you don't do the get player camera manager that is the function under player. We want to get this one with the little blue icon next to it. So I'm going to get that, and I'm just going to say from the get camera manager, if I type in the words up vector, I can get the up vector of the camera, which means get the direction that upwards is. And if you remember how the camera is set up, because it's looking down at the player, up is going to be up on the screen, which is what we want to have. So all I need to do now is plug this into the direction and this into the scale. I'm now going to quickly do almost the exact same thing. So I'm going to copy all of this except the input. I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Control W, and I'm now going to go input right, and this is going to be plugged in here with the axis value plugged in here. However, instead of the up vector, this is going to be right vector. So that gives us the direction in a particular with a particular scale assigned to it. And now, if we look at how that's set up in game, if I hit play, I can rotate with my mouse and W, S, A, D. So it all works perfectly. And we're all set up. And that's all it takes. So now that we've added movement, we're going to quickly add one additional thing, which is the ability to jump. Now we've already set this up in the Anim blueprint, so all we need to do is go back to our project settings, then into input. This time, instead of adding an axis mapping, we're going to be adding an action mapping, because we don't actually need an axis value with jumps. Now you could potentially set this up as some sort of axis mapping, if you wanted to have, say, a jetpack or something, you know, with limited jump abilities that were being bound together. I'm not quite sure how you'd want it set up, but in this instance, we're going to just set it up as an action, because we really just want you to hit the button and you to just launch in the air. So I'm going to go jump, and I'm going to set this to be the spacebar. And now within my player controller, I'm going to then simply go, if they say jump, get the controlled pawn. And now we can't call jump on it. And the reason that we can't call jump on it is because jump isn't built into pawn. However, it is built into character. So I'm going to get my pawn, and I'm going to cast it to a character. And then as a character, if I type in the word jump, you see that we now have this available here. And if I hit compile and save, our character is now able to jump. And she will correctly play the jump in and jump out animations. Now one thing that is happening here, you'll notice, is that as she jumps in the air, notice we're getting a bit of a pop on her arms. So the reason we're getting that pop in her arms is because we need to go into the animation blueprint. So I'm going to go Content Browser, and I'm going to go to my assets and open up the animation blueprint. And in the jump mid state, so that's available from here, I'm going to open up the jump mid state. You'll see that we're currently telling it to play the falling animation. However, the falling animation is set to loop. Instead, I want this to play, and then at the end of it, stop looping. So once I've checked that box, and I hit jump, you'll see that her arms are no longer popping out. So they still go out, but they're no longer doing that weird little pop as the animation attempted to loop. And that's it. That's all it took. Jumps set up, movement set up. Let's move on to the next stuff. So now that we have movement going on, it's time for us to start looking at the fun stuff, which means it's time for us to start looking at attacks. So to do this, we're going to need to get a few things set up. And the very first thing that I'm going to get you to do is to open up your project settings, and we're going to create a new input. Now when we do this, we're going to be setting up something for attacking. So I'm going to set up two binds when I do this. I'm going to have under input, action mappings, I'm going to have melee attack, and I'm also going to have another action mapping for magic attack, which we'll do later. So we have melee and we have magic. Now, let's get that set up. So now I've created melee attack and magic attack, and I'm just going to bind these to left mouse and right mouse. So I'm going to go survival map, I'm going to open up my content browser, and I'm going to open specifically my player controller, and I'm quickly just going to hook this up. So in my player controller, I'm going to have melee attack. And when melee attack is pressed, it's going to call a function on my character. And the other one that I'm going to have here is I'm going to have magic attack. Now those functions that they're going to call are currently not set up. So let's go into our character class and set those up now. I'm going to make a custom event called try melee. And I'm going to make another one called try magic. Okay, so we've got these two set up. Now, the nicest way for us to kind of handle this is to set it up such that they're just going to play an anim montage. Now, to begin with, I'm going to have this in its simplest form. And this is going to get redone as we move on. But to begin with, we're going to be playing what's called an anim montage, or a montage. Now, an anim montage is essentially, it's like an animation, which you would typically play, except it has a lot of extra information in it, including section data, as well as anim notifies. And I'll go through those as we move on. But to begin with, we're going to be playing an anim montage, and that montage is going to be created from an asset within Blueprint. So the asset we're going to be creating, I want you to right-click on Player Attack 1, and I want you to create an anim montage. And instead of just hitting enter on this, I want you to call this Night Attack Montage. Now if I double click on this anim montage, you'll see that if I hit play, it's just playing this single simple animation. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to close that down, and I'm just going to set that up as the anim montage that we have in here. Now within the player controller, I'm going to get a reference to my character. So I'm going to get the controlled pawn, and I'm going to cast to a KG character, and on pressed, I'm going to get the play anim montage, and I'm going to set this up. Now before we continue, I need to actually set this up within my animation blueprint to get full effect. So, it's not going to work because we currently haven't actually set up slots to play the anim montage. So to do this, I need to open up the content browser and open up my animation blueprint. Now at the moment, this animation blueprint is simply the animation plugged into the final pose. It has no slots for me to actually play montages in. And slots are kind of sections that we can blend in certain ways. For instance, I like to have an upper body slot and a full body slot. An upper body slot would be just something that I'm purely doing from the waist upwards, so that's really good for attacks if you don't want your legs to get in the way. A full body slot would be something that would have full motion in it, so it could be like a victory dance or something else. Now in this instance, we we've already got the locomotion plugged straight into the final animation pose, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set it up so that we can have full slot support. And to begin with, what I need to do is drag off of this. I'm going to type in the word cache, and you see that we have a new cache saved pose. I'm going to just quickly name this to just locomotion cache and connect it to here. And what this essentially does is the locomotion plays once through the state machine and caches whatever animation it thinks it's meant to be playing in the locomotion cache. Now the reason we do that is so that when we do a blend, we can then only calculate this one time and blend it with varying animations without having to like recalculate the entire state machine again and again. So I've cached it, and from here I'm going to do a layered blend per bone. Now a layered blend per bone lets me get two poses and blend them according to wherever the bones that I've set up in the branching are. Which means if I tell it to play in the spine, I can say play this part in the spine and play this part below the spine. So that would be my legs and my upper body. So this means from here I'm going to set up two branches. The first one is going to be spine 01, because I know that's the name of the bone that I'll be doing it on. And I'm going to set the blend depth to 3. I'm going to add another one, and I'm going to set this up to be upper arm underscore L, which is where we're going to be holding our sword. And we're going to set the blend depth to -5. Set this to mesh space rotation as well, so that it doesn't play in the bone space. Now that's all we need to do to have that section set up, but now I need to actually tell it what to blend in. So if I get this and I drag back, you can see that we can do a slot. Now at the moment we've only got slot default available, and the reason for that is it's the only slot that's actually been set up. So if I click this little magnifying glass, we get this option available, and this lets me create a new slot, which I'm going to call upper body. I'm now going to set this to be my upper body slot. I'm also going to get my cached pose and tell it that that's the source of the animation. Finally, the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this upper body, Control W, and I'm going to set this to be the full body slot. Now at the moment we just have default slot, so I'm going to add another slot that is going to be called full body, and I'm going to set this to be full body. Now, I'm going to run through this chain really quickly so you can get an idea of how this actually works. If there's nothing playing in the upper body slot, the thing that it's going to be blending in is going to be the same, so the cached animation pose. If there is something playing in the upper body slot, it's going to blend that in my top half of my body and into my left arm. If there's something playing in the full body slot, it's going to override all of that information and play it across the board on the entire body. If there's nothing playing, it'll just let this part through. I'm going to hit compile, and that's all we need to have that initial section set up to play montages. So finally, I'm going to go back to the animation montage that we set up in my content browser, Night Attack Montage, and I'm going to tell this that you're meant to play in the upper body slot. Save, play. And you can now see that we're starting to get some animation here. However, it's doing something a bit strange, which is it's not actually blending in and out correctly. That's okay, we're going to look at that next. In the next section, we're going to be going through how to actually set up an anim montage and set up anim montage sections. But that's it for getting slots covered. In the previous session, we set up the anim blueprint to support montages. It's time for us to go further and actually set up the montage so that it can play an entire combo within it. I'm going to open up the attack montage now. And this is what we had set up earlier. We had a simple singular attack. But I want more than that. If I go to this, I can see that player attack does that, but if I scroll down in my asset browser, I can also see that there's a swing one end. So I'm going to drag this in, and you'll notice that we now can go from one animation to the other. Okay? I'm now going to get swing 2, and I'm going to drag that in as well. So we have attack 1 and attack 2. So I'm dragging in attack 2. Now it's going to look a bit weird when we first do it, but that's okay. I'm now going to get swing 2 end and drag that in. We've now got attack 1 and attack 2, swing 1 and swing 2 end. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up so that the game knows that these are sections that relate to each other. To do that, all I have to do here is I right click and I create a new montage section. And this section is going to be called Attack 1. Now, by default, it's gone ahead and added it alongside a default montage, and I don't want that, so I'm going to right click, and to be clear, you need to really right click on that green line and hit delete section, and that'll get rid of the default one. So we have Attack 1. Let's keep going. I'm going to add another new montage section, and this is going to be called Attack 1 End, or End 1 actually. So we now have Attack 1 and End 1. And if I click here, again, new montage section, and this is going to be Attack 2. And over here, End 2. Now, if I scroll down the bottom here, I can see that each of these sections are all in this line where it says Preview All Sections. Now, what this is actually telling the game is that if you ever play Attack 1, play End 1 next, then play Attack 2, and then play End 2. But I don't actually want that. So watch what happens if I click the X next to this. It removes it and takes it out of the chain. I'm going to do that again. And if I hit Preview on this, it'll now just play Attack 1 followed by End 1. Attack 1, End 1. Over and over again. Now, I'm going to do the same thing, but after Attack 1, I'm going to play End 2. Now, you can't drag up, which may be what you expect to happen. Instead, I have to click Attack 2 and then tell it that the next piece is End 2. I can now preview, and I can see that End 2 works and Attack 1 works. Now, the reason I'm doing it this way is what we're going to be doing is we're going to make it so that when you attack, the game's going to go, okay, is the animation playing already? No, it's not. In that case, I'll fire off the anim montage. Oh, it is playing already. If it is playing already, let's see if they're in this Attack 1 section. And if they are, let's make the next section Attack 2 instead of End 1. That way I can then just cleanly work between those two. So here to here. So that's all we're going to do to set it up. And to do that, I'm now going to click Save. And I'll show you in the next section how to tie together individual and montage sections. I want you to open up your character base. And where we currently have the try melee event, it's just currently calling play anim montage. Now, what we're going to do instead is we're first going to check to see if that montage is already active. So, to do that, what I need to do is right-click and type in anim instance and get the anim instance. Now, this is going to be a reference essentially to our blueprint, our animation blueprint. And what we're going to do is off of that, we're going to say, is the montage active? Which means we can look up a montage, such as the attack montage, and see if that's currently active. Now, if that's currently active, so if the montage is already playing, that's when we would do a combo. Now, if it's not playing, that's when we will launch into the montage itself. So, try melee is going to plug into the branch, and this is going to be in the false. So, if that's currently not active, we want to start playing it. And the section we want to start at is Attack 1. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is, if this is true, then what we want to do is we want to find out what the current section that's playing is. So we're going to get current section. And the section we're going to look up is in the night montage. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to drag off of this and I'm going to do a switch. Now, by doing a switch, what it lets me do is, depending on the result that comes through here, to do a different next animation. And I'll show you how that works. I'm going to click on the switch and I'm going to add a pin. And you'll notice it's given me a new output. Now, I'm going to be checking, am I currently in Attack 1? Because if I'm in Attack 1, what I want to do is set up the next attack to be Attack 2 instead of End 1. So, to do that, all I need to do is get the anim instance and call montage set next section. I'm going to plug this into Attack 1. I'm also going to just quickly clean this up a little with some reroute nodes by double clicking. Cool. Now I've got that, I'm referencing that there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say the section name to change is going to be the montage get current section. So we already know what section we're in, which should be just attack 1. And the section that I want to switch into is going to be attack 2. So we're going to switch from one to the other. I'm going to compile and save. So before I hit play, the very last thing I need to do is, instead of calling the play anim montage that we set up, I need to go to my controller and I need to call the function try melee. Compile, save, and now I'm going to hit play. And you'll see that it's playing the first, and if I double click during the attack, it'll now play the second swipe. See that? So it's switching between the animations. However, if I just play once, it'll do the correction, and if I do the second, it'll also do it. Now the cool thing with this is that the system is really simple, and if I had multiple animations that I was switching to, I could actually say add pin. If this is playing attack 2, set attack 3, so whatever combo I wanted to have, as the next thing. And I could have an entire combo chain set up by literally just adding switch section names into this little bit here. That's all it would take. Now the next thing that we're going to do, now that we've got that basic stuff in there, is move on to magic. So we have a character that can play animations, but we're now going to need to attach some sort of sword to her hand. So as she swings it around, she's actually, swiping at something. So to do that, I'm going to go to my content browser, and under assets, I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm just going to call this weapons. Now, it's worth noting that if you wanted to do this section differently, you're more than welcome to import the Infinity Blade weapons. You could have a whole bunch of different swords coming in that way, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to be using S-Sword Basic as the mesh. So I'm going to import that in. And I'm going to auto-generate collision, that's fine. Yep, import. It's automatically created a material for me, but that's actually okay. So I'm quickly going to set the material to just be a very, very boring gray. So 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And we're going to set the metallic on it to 0.8. Actually, I might go 1. I'm going to set the roughness I think 0.3 is going to be good. Yep, so it's 0.3. So now that that's set up, I'm going to save this material and quickly just make sure it looks okay on the sword. Yep, that'll do. That's fine. So save. At which point I'm now going to go about adding a socket to the skeleton. So what that means is the skeleton asset under Knight, skeleton, I'm going to open this up. Essentially what we're going to do is add a little place that at any stage the game's able to look at it and find out where it is and what the rotation is. And we can use that to add assets to her hand easily. So in this case, the thing that I'm going to be after is hand_R. If you want to search for it, you can always type it up top. So I'm going to get her right hand, and I'm going to right click here, and I'm just going to click add socket. And I'm going to call this socket sword. Now, upon doing so, I'm going to get rid of my filter because it's filtering it out. I'm just going to set this up. Now you could move it around the viewport. I suggest actually right clicking on this and hitting add preview asset and setting up the sword as a preview asset. You can see that it's currently running up her arm from that location. So in this situation, I already know the values that I want to have for the socket. I want to have this set to -5. 1.8, and I'm going to set the rotation here to 90, and I'm going to set that to 90 as well. So I'm just going to put this just generally in her hand. Now that I look at it, I could probably move it down just a little bit. Great, that'll do. So now that that's set up, we can see that that socket will work well for the sword. Now what I'm going to be doing is, in game, I'm going to create a blueprint sword that she's going to have, and it's going to be attached to her hand. So it's at this point that we now want to go through and quickly just give the character a sword. So I'm just going to go content, and I'm going to open up my blueprint for the character, which is under blueprints, and I'm going to open up Knight character base. And all I'm going to do to get this working is just make sure that in begin play, I'm going to make a function called create sword. So in begin play, I'm not going to even bother making it a full function, I'll just do it as an event. So I'm going to right click, custom event, and it's just going to be called create sword. Now the reason I'm doing that is that on begin play, we're going to call create sword. And when we create a sword, what we do is we're going to spawn an actor from class. And this is going to be our sword class. Now, you'll notice that we haven't actually done that just yet. So let's go ahead and quickly set that up. I'm going to go to my blueprints. I'm going to right click. I'm going to create a new blueprint that's an actor. And it's just going to be called base sword. And if I go to base sword, I'm going to just add a static mesh component, sword mesh, and I'm going to set that to be my sword. I'm not going to bother with the actual functionality just yet. I just want to make sure that I have a working attachment. So back in my character, I'm going to set this to be a base sword, and I'm also then going to call attach component. Now it's going to be looking for a spawn transform, so I might as well just get the actor transform for the time being. And then under attach to component, I'm going to attach, this is going to get attached to the mesh. So I'm going to drag the mesh in by holding control. And I'm going to tell it that I want to attach it to the sword socket. And I want it to snap to that location. So snap, snap, snap. Not going to weld it just yet because I don't believe I'll need to. And the other thing that I'm going to do here, just to keep the game reasonably simple, is I'm going to make a new variable that is going to be the sword. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to hit promote to variable on that output and just call it weapon. So we're now going to store a reference to the weapon that we've created inside the character. Compile, save, and now if I hit play, you'll see that she's holding a sword, and when she swings, we get a really nice, simple swing. Now, one thing that's happening right now is that as I hold down W, we're actually starting to collide with that mesh. So I'm going to need to make sure that for the time being, this sword is actually set up to not have any collision. I'm actually just going to set it up to ignore the pawn. So that should just ignore us. Now when I hit play, I'm now able to run around without it. Great. So that's all we need for the time being to get her a very simple sword with an attack that we can then combo. And from here, we're now going to look at giving the sword actual attacks. So it's time for us to add notifiers to allow the sword to actually deal damage. Now this is just one solution in implementing this. We could be running traces off of the sword and checking what it's stabbing against, but because this is a rather simple game, I'm simply going to do an overlap check at the end of a cut and see if I'm currently overlapping any enemies. If I am, I'm going to deal damage to them. So to do that, I need to go ahead and open up the animation montage and add some notifiers. So essentially a notify is something that calls an event within your animation blueprint. So when this is open, I'm going to stop for a second and I'm going to get the timeline, and I'm going to first off just put the timeline roughly where I want damage to occur in the event of an attack. I think right here would be really good. So I'm going to put the scrub there so I can see where it is, and I'm going to right click on the notifies track down the very bottom and click add notify, new notify, and I'm going to call this attack, deal damage from sword. It's a super verbose one, but that's okay. So I've added that there, and now I'm going to go through and I'm also going to add that to the other cut. So I'm going to go to here, and I feel like that would be really good at about this position. So I'm going to right click, add notify, and you'll see that deal damage from sword is available now as an option. So I'm going to click on that. Now, with those in place, what I'm actually able to do is go to the animation blueprint, And within the animation blueprint, I can go to the event graph. Within here, I'm able to actually go ahead and set up what to do when that notifier is called. So if I right click and I type in deal damage, you'll notice that we have event anim notifier deal damage from sword. And this essentially means that when that attack goes through, this is going to get called. So that's really good for us because we can actually go ahead and, as before, we can try to get the pawn owner. And this time we cast to a character base. So if the pawn owner is a character base, the one that we've set up, we're then also going to see if they have a weapon. So we're going to go get weapon, and I can right click on this and do a validated get, which means if they do have a weapon, we can now call a function on it. So the reason that's really good for us is that we can now just simply add a function to the weapon that is going to be deal damage. So for this, all I need to do is go to my weapon class that we created. So I'm going to go to blueprints and open up base sword. It's time for us to create an event that's just going to be called try deal damage. Okay, so this is going to try to deal damage to things that are within an overlapping sphere. So to do this, what I need to do is right click and type in sphere overlap. And you see that we have a nice option here that says sphere overlap actors. And what this does is this allows us to create a sphere at a given position and within a radius of it, return all of the actors that it's overlapping. So to do this, I'm going to connect this. And the first thing we need to do is say where the sphere is. And the sphere is going to be located where the sword is. So I'm going to get the sword location. So I'm going to get the world location and just connect it. Next up, I'm just going to ballpark this and set the sphere radius to say 120. Now it's asking for object types and actors to ignore. So I know the object types that I want, and I can type in make array, and it will actually let me just add anything I want to this. And in this instance, the only thing I actually want to hit are pawns. But I don't want to hit myself. That's bad. So I'm going to get the actors to ignore, and I'm going to make an array. So to go further than this, what I need to do is tell it to ignore myself. But how do I tell the sword to ignore the thing that's holding it? There's a little trick to that. What we can actually do is we can get the scene root, which is the base, and I can get the scene root, I can type in get attach parent, which gets me the thing it's attached to. And since I know it's attached to the player, I can then call get owner. And this will actually return a reference to the player itself. So this gets a scene component, and this returns the actor that is the owner of that scene component. So from here, we're now going to be overlapping and creating something that's going to be returning, in theory, whatever my sword is over. All I need to do from here is go to the output actors, and for each actor that's being overlapped in this instance, I need to simply apply damage. So we could do point damage, but in this instance, I'm just going to apply general damage because it's simpler. And the amount of damage I'm going to apply per hit is going to say, let's do 50 damage. Compile, save. Now the next thing that we need to add here is what happens when we actually receive damage. So I can do that really quickly by going to my character base, and I can right click and hit event damage. And you'll notice that there's already functions that we can create that are what happens when we receive damage. So I'm just going to go event any damage. And it's at this time that I'm going to create a variable that is going to be called health. And I'm going to set the health to be 100 by default. And all I'm going to do here is rather simple. I'm going to drag the health in, and I'm going to say health subtract the amount of damage that's being dealt is the new health. And if this value, this new health, is less than or equal to 0, I'm going to play anim montage. I'm going to play an anim montage, and it's going to be a death anim montage. So I'm going to quickly create that by going to my content browser. I'm going to go to Assets, Night, and we have a death anim that we can play, which is just here, play a death. I'm just going to go create anim montage, and I'm just going to call this player death. So back in the character, I'm going to set this to be the death one, and I'm going to make sure that this death animation montage that we just added is set to play in the correct slot. So at the moment, this is what it's going to do. It's going to play through like this. What I want to do is I want to make sure that first off, we don't bother blending out. So I'm going to set that to 0. And next up, I'm going to make sure that the asset itself is going to play through, and at the end of it, we're going to die. But I need to make sure that it's playing in the full body slot that we created earlier. So I'm going to hit save. And now in the character base, I'm going to just set this up really quickly to say play the death. That's going to play in the full body slot by default. Now this value that gets returned from a montage is actually the duration of the montage. And what's interesting about that is that if I type in delay and set it to the amount of time that's going to last for, and then destroy actor, we've theoretically got an entire combat chain now that will work. So the last step that we need to do to get this working is to make sure that weapon actually calls try deal damage. So I'm going to plug that in just here inside the animation blueprint. And now when I hit play, now at the moment there's a bit of an issue that we're destroying the player, we're not destroying the sword, and in addition to that, she can die multiple times, which is bad. So you can see that when I swipe through, she's just falling over. So let's quickly set that up to correctly work. All I need to do is, so at the moment this chain in any damage is automatically going through. I forgot to add the branch. So when I did this, I needed to drag off that and say if it's less than or equal to 0, and that's true, that's going to deal damage and she'll die. And I want to make sure that this function, this death animation, is only called once. So I'm going to type in do once, do once, and I'm going to add that. So now she'll only ever die once. The other thing that I need to do is I need to stop the movement. So stop movement immediately is a thing that I can call here. And if I want to, I can actually disable the movement component entirely. So disable movement is another option. So I'm going to get that, and I'm going to call that before the delay because we want her to not run around and do anything. Now this will instantaneously vary it out, and this sets it to none. So we don't need stop movement immediately. We can just straight up use disable movement. And the final thing I'm going to do before this is all over is I'm not just going to destroy the actor, I'm also going to get a reference to the weapon, and I'm going to call destroy on that as well. So I'm going to destroy both my weapon and myself. That way everything disappears. Compile, save, play, and now I'm going to run up and just test it out. 1, 2, she falls over and then she disappears. And everything is good. So that's all it took to get fully working functionality in there for combat. And now it's time to actually set it up so that the enemy can do the same. So in the last video, we set it up so that we could actually attack the enemy. But, you know, this game's kind of unfair right now. We really want to make sure the enemy can attack us right back. So what I'm going to be doing this time around is setting up a very, very basic AI loop. And I want to point out that how I'm setting this up is using just the controller, and it is a good idea to investigate things like behavior trees to decide what kind of thing you actually want to use for your AI, what kind of system you want to have controlling it. Since we essentially only have 2 states in this entire thing, we have wandering and we have pursuing to stabbing, I'm just going to leave it like that with just a very, very simple AI controller, but be aware that you can expand on it. So I'm going to go to my AI controller base, and I'm going to open this up and build from what we already have. Now at the moment, I'm setting a timer by event that every 5 seconds I'm telling the AI to wander. But if you think about that, that's no longer really what I want to do. What I want to do instead is I want to have some sort of target variable. And if I currently have a target, I want to run after the target. If I don't have a target, then I want to wander. So let's go ahead and actually create that variable. This is going to be called target, and I'm going to set it to be of type I'm going to assume for the time being that the only things that we're going to be chasing down are going to be night game characters. So it's now a reference to a night game character base. So I've dropped that in, and what I'm going to do is, instead of doing a set timer by event to wander, I'm going to create a new event that I'm just going to call, so custom event, I'm going to call this process AI. And instead of that being plugged into there, I'm going to plug this in, the process AI, into there instead. So let's run through these steps. First off, we're processing the AI. What do I do? Well, let's see if we've got a target. So I'm going to convert the target to a validated get. Now, if this is not valid, then I probably want to check if there's an enemy around me. If it is valid, then I want to move to it. Okay? So in that case, what I want to do is, if it is not valid, let's see if I can get an enemy. So to do that, I'm going to do the exact same thing that I did with a sword before, whereby I do a sphere overlap. I'm just going to do this is not going to even factor in line of sight. I need to really stress just how basic this is. So we're going to do a sphere overlap around where I am. So I'm going to get actor location. So my actor location is the sphere position. I'm going to check 1,000 units, which is 10 meters around me. And what I'm going to do is, if this comes back with the correct object type, I'm going to then tell it to go do what this would have done if this was valid. However, first off, we need to go set up the things that we had before. And that is, I need to make sure that we're ignoring self. So I'm going to make array, and I'm going to put a reference to my controlled pawn. So I'm going to get my controlled pawn in the AI, which will be the bad guy. And I'm going to tell them to be ignored by this check. And I'm also going to do a make array on this and make sure that this is set to only look for pawns. So we're doing a 1,000 unit check, at which point, if this is coming out, we also need to then see if any of these, so for each loop, we need to see if any of these are actually a reference to the player, because we don't want to attack other AIs, we just want to attack the player. So in this situation, what I'm going to do is, for everything that we've overlapped, I'm going to say, let's check to see if this actually has a player controller. So I'm going to cast it to a character base, and if that's true, then I'm also going to go and check the controller. So I'm going to get the controller, and there's a nice little function I can drag off of from that is player controller. So if this is a player controller, then we're going to set this character base to be the target. So I'm going to drag in the target reference, and if this is true, we're going to set it. Now I can't just connect it like I have there. Instead, I need to have a branch, which is simply going to say, if this is true, then we set this to this. And I think it's a good idea for me to quickly add some extra pins to set everything up. So this is now going to say, run through, check if it's a player controller. If it is, they're our target. And other thing we want to do is we want to break out of that loop, because we now have a target, so there's no point in us checking anything else in that section. And all I'm going to do here is, when this is completed, I'm going to do another one of these validity checks to see if the target is now valid. So I'm going to drag that out. And if this is valid now, what I'm going to do is process the same thing that I would have processed otherwise, and if not, I'll just let it be. So what would I process otherwise? Well, I would do AI move to, and I would tell them to move to my target. So I'm going to connect the target actor to that. I'm going to tell them that their acceptance radius is actually about, let's go with 50 units. And from there, I'm going to get, the pawn is going to be my controlled pawn. So that's going to be the AI's body. I'm just going to connect this is valid to that. And finally, on success, so if we actually get there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say on success, I want to try to actually attack the player. So in that instance, I'm going to get the controlled pawn again, On success, I'm going to make sure that we have a character base, and if we do, I'm going to try melee. Now, with that said, the only thing that we haven't done here is I need to make sure that we still enter the wander state. So I'm going to put that there. And what I'm going to say here is if that fails and then we can't see anyone, let's just call wander. So if that fails, let's just call wander. And if that is valid, we're going to connect it to that. I'm going to move this up here, and hopefully that's a little bit more visible. So compile, save. Now I'm also going to reduce this timer from 5 to 2 seconds. Check it a little bit more regularly. And now if I run up top, you can see that she ran up and she hit me, and I'm dead. So that worked quite well. And that's it. That's all it took to get some basic AI running. If I wanted to play against it this time, ha, I win. Woo. So, in the next session, we're going to start to actually go through and begin adding some gameplay. So in this instance, what we're going to require is we're going to need some flinch animations for when you get hit, so you get a little bit of an effect. As well as that, I'm going to go through and add some pickups, and then after that, we're going to move on to the magic. So for this session, we're going to be setting up the character to correctly flinch. That means that whenever you get hit, we want to have a reaction. Now there are ultimately two types of reactions I would like to add to the game. I would like to have both the ability to get hit and flinch, as well as the ability to have a pulling your sword back kind of animation whenever a hit is kind of deflected. So we have animations for both of those things, but for the time being, I'm just going to be setting up the flinch animations. So if you go to your assets and you type in flinch, you'll see that we have player flinch big and player flinch small. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play player flinch big if you get hit while you're in the end attack sequence. Okay, so this is going to play if you are currently finishing an attack. That way, if you mistime your attack, you've got kind of punished for it. Player flinch small is what I'll play generally the rest of the time. So we've got those two in there. I'm going to go to, first off, right click on here, and I'm going to create a anim montage, and I'm going to call this just player flinch. So we've called it player flinch, and now that we've got that set up, I'm going to double click it, and you can see at the moment that it's just kind of not doing a whole lot. If I hit play, she'll do that, but it's in the default slot. So I'm going to change this to the upper slot because I actually don't mind if my legs don't do anything specific. I'm going to add in the player flinch small animation asset, so just drag that in. Add a new montage section, which is just going to be called flinch big. You'll notice that when I do that, it's kind of it's put both of these on the same location. I'm going to delete default. So default is there right now. I'm going to delete it. And instead I'm going to go over here and add a new montage section that's called flinch small. So we have flinch big and flinch small. At the moment it thinks it's meant to play them one after the other, but I don't want that. I want them playing independently of one another, so I just click on that little X. We've now got them as separate things. So I'm going to click save. And now it's time for us to quickly add some feedback, which means we're going to go to our character blueprint. And now that we're in our character blueprint, what we're going to be doing is setting it up so that in this any damage section, we go through, we subtract the health. If health is less than or equal to 0, we play the death sequence. But in my situation, I don't just want to play the death sequence, I also want to go about, if we survive, I then want to play a hit montage. So the issue here is that I need to play the anim montage on the character, but I need to make sure that the anim montage section that I'm playing is correct in relation to the type of hit that we're taking. So it's a big one if we're in the end section or not. So the nicest way for me to kind of go about doing that is going to be to create a quick check that we see if there's a current anime montage playing, as we did before, we can look at the section and say, well, look, if we got hit while the animation is playing and it's not an attack, then it's currently one of your weak periods. So if that's the case, we're going to go off and compare that and play a big hit or a small hit. So I'm going to copy all of this information here, so mesh, anim instance, active, and current selection that we had before. And I'm just going to paste them down here. I just hit Control B instead of Control V. There we go, Control V. So after we go into that, I'm going to branch. And all I'm going to say is, currently, is the attack montage playing? Now, if it is playing, what we're going to do is see if we're currently playing an attack move or not. And if we are playing an attack move, then I'm going to just play the smaller one, and if we're not playing an attack move, but it is playing, then I'm going to play the big one. So it's only at the end of the hits that if you get hit. And part of the reason for this is down the track we're going to change this logic around to also have blocking playing. So we'll go through that, and we'll have that all set up reasonably soon. But what I'm going to do is, first off, create that list that's going to check the names against the list of attack moves. So how I can do that is I can create an array of names. So I'm going to call this attack moves. And the type is going to be set to name. And I'm just going to click on that button there to make it an array. And I'm going to add the two attacks that we've already got in the game. Attack 2 and attack 1. Great. So the reason I've created that array is that, first off, is this currently playing? If that's false, then that's fine, because if it's false, then we know that what we want to do is play the flinch montage, and we want to play flinch small, I believe it was called. Let me just confirm. So we want to play flinch small. And if it's true, we're now going to say, okay, contains, is the current section that's playing one of my attack moves? And if that's false, so if that's false, then we'll assume it's one of the bigger weak points. So I'm going to drop this in and set that to be flinch big. So we're going to be playing this one up here. So plug that into false. And once again, we don't need to worry too much about what's going on here, because that's all death. However, there is one other little thing that I would like to do. We're going to create a variable that sets it up so that we can't attack while we're flinching. So see, try melee at the moment is kind of set up there. What we're going to be doing is setting up this with a branch. And I'm going to create a variable for this called isFlinching. And if they are flinching, we don't want to be able to attack. But if they aren't flinching, we do want to be able to do the attack. So isFlinching is now in there. And what I'm going to do is, when we go to play one of these animations, we're going to set isFlinching to true. And this section here, if I type delay, by dragging off of this float, this return value is the length of the animation that's going to play. So by dragging off of that, I'm actually able to tell it that, you know, after this many seconds, we set isFlinching to false. Now, this is going to work. It's got a couple of issues that could potentially pop up, such as if I get hit twice in different ways, those delays will still play off. So we probably want to do that with a timer that we can kind of clear and pass around. But for the time being, that's going to be enough to have this system somewhat working. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to hit play. Now, the last thing I needed to do, by default, isFlinching should be set to false. So you can see that's, I can now attack. And if I run over to you and I hit her, we've ended up with a bit of an issue. So a little issue from what we've just created is I forgot to account for one little thing, which is by telling it that is flinching is here, you need to make sure that at the end of every outcome here, there's some way for is flinching to be set back to false again. So at the moment I created the issue whereby if you hit them while they were hitting you, this would go through and is flinching would never be set to false. So I'm actually just going to set that up there. Now when we add blocking in, which is two attacks hitting one another, this should never get called because it'll get caught before we deal damage. But this is really all we need for the time being to have that working. So if I hit compile and save, I'm now going to change one other little thing. And what that thing is if I go to player flinch, at the moment the blend time is quite high, it's 0.25, and I really want this to be a very low blend time. So we want to go straight into that flinch. So I'm going to hit save now, and when I go into it, we should be able to see the player flinch when hit. So you saw her get hit once then, and now I'm falling over and dying. Now, that actually changes one other thing for us that we should consider, which is we currently don't enter flinching when we die, and the reason we want to do that is we want to make sure that we can block attacks when we die as well. So after this do once, I'm just going to set is flinching to true and make sure that that's all correct. Compile save, and we should no longer be able to attack when we die. Cool, that's mostly sorted. The other thing that I'm going to now go ahead and quickly tweak is at the moment the player is their camera is snapping in and out, and the reason their camera is snapping in and out is the mesh. By default, we've got two things that can potentially block the camera traces. So if you look here, this is currently set to block those, and I think it's okay for ours, but we probably want to make sure that the spring arm on our character isn't actually being assessed from this low. Instead, I'm going to move my spring arm up to be assessed from about this height. This way, anything getting between me and the arm at this low level isn't going to cause the popping in and out whenever the sword hits. So if I go back to this, now when she hits me, my camera's not popping around and I'm dying. There's one other little thing I'm sure you can notice is that as I die, if I spin my mouse, the character is still rotating to position. So I'm quickly just going to tweak that as well, and then we should have most of the hit system in place. So to tweak that system that we have, I'm going to load up my player controller. And in this section where we rotate to the mouse, so we rotate to the location, I'm only going to do that if my pawn is still alive. So at the moment I'm getting the control pawn, but I actually want to cast this to a character. And the reason I'm casting it is so we can check the health. So I can actually just make this an AND. So if health is greater than 0 and this is returning true, so I can just do the AND symbol. So if those two conditions are true, then process movement, but only if both of those conditions are true. Plug that in, compile save. And now there's me getting hit, and you'll notice that I'm no longer spinning to my body, I'm just falling down on the spot. And that's all we needed to do. So we've now got all of our basic hits in. It's time for us to start extending the functionality so they've got a little bit more than a sword. In this video we're going to be covering magic. Now, there's a few stages to magic. First is creating all of the effects that we're going to use for the magic related activity. The next thing that we're going to have is going to be actually setting up the projectiles themselves. So let's start with the fun stuff and get some effects work done. I'm going to go to Content, Assets, and I'm going to create a new folder that's just going to be called Effects. And in the same way with the pinball project, I'm going to create a material that's going to be called m_simple spot. Now, simple spot is going to be a very simple material that we're going to use for the particles, so we can kind of have them looking nice without using any actual texture lookups in the process. It's just going to be programmatically determined. I'm going to set this to be translucent blend mode and an unlit shading model. The other thing I'm going to do is under the section that says used with particle sprites, I'm going to make sure that's enabled. And finally, one other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to enable responsive AA. Now, responsive AA is what we use to kind of bypass the anti-aliasing for particles. Because Unreal uses temporal anti-aliasing by default, what that can kind of do is it can anti-alias out your effects that are very, very small. So anti-aliasing typically kind of smooths out the edges and gets rid of jagged bits. But because effects are so small, they're small enough that they get filtered by the AA. And this is especially true with temporal. It's just one of those drawbacks from using it. So we need to make sure that responsive AA is checked. Now that we've done that, I'm going to add a particle color node. And I'm going to have the alpha multiplied against a simple radial gradient exponential. So if I get this and I type radial gradient exponential, you'll see it there. Just going to plug that straight in and connect that to opacity. So you can see we've got our particle there. And then I'm going to plug this into the emissive itself. So this gets us that simple white particle. Now, this effect doesn't necessarily need to be translucent. If we wanted to, we could also potentially go additive, but I like having full control, and we're not having a particularly effects-heavy game, so I think it's okay to use translucency here. So I'm going to apply and save. And at this point, I'm now going to create the particle system. And that's going to be called P_impulse, because we're going to have two effects. We've got the flight particle system, which is as the particle system moves through the air, that's the system that you'll be able to see. And then we've got the explosion itself. And to be blunt, the explosion is the most fun. So we're going to start with that one. So the explosion effect is going to be a radial effect that's going to push out from the center. So this means we're going to have to do a couple of things to get this right. Now, to begin with, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this from being a spawned by rate to a burst spawn. And that means we're going to go here to the spawn section, rate, and we're going to set the rate to 0. Now, what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to use what's called a burst list to simultaneously spawn 500 particles. So, under burst list, add, count, 500. And you can see that we've got this happening now. Now, the next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that we're using GPU sprites rather than standard sprites. So go here, and under type data, click new GPU sprites. So this means that this effect is going to have way less overhead because it's being calculated by the GPU. So at this point, I'm going to go through and actually set up my material to use the simple spot that we created. Just type in the word simple and you'll see simple spot. And that's what we're getting at the moment, which is a pretty big effect. As before, I'm going to set this to a velocity alignment while I'm in here so that the effect aligns itself with the direction that it's currently moving in. So now that we've got that set up, let's actually stretch it along that axis. So if I go to here and go to initial size, I'm going to set the size to be equal to the vector. So we're going to go 5. We're going to set this to 5 and 1. And I'm going to set the y-axis to be between 50 and 25. And z doesn't matter because it's just an xy effect. So you can see we've thinned that out a lot. Obviously, though, I don't actually want it moving upwards. So I'm going to get this initial velocity and delete it. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to location. And I'm going to make it spawn in a sphere. Now, by default, you can see they're just doing this. And what we really want them to do is explode outwards. So here's how we do that. We go to sphere and we set it up so that it's not on the positive or negative z axes, which means that they'll all spawn in a flat circle. Next up, what we're going to do is enable velocity. You can see that they're now spreading out from that location. And that's kind of cool. However, we also want to go to velocity scale. and set these up to have an actual speed that they're shooting out at. Now I find it good to have a uniform speed, which means we pick a range. So I'm going to set this to be between 4 and 15. So now they're kind of shooting out like that. However, my radius on my circle, it's not ideal. It's quite small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up and under start radius, I'm going to set the radius to be between 50, but sometimes pushing all the way up to 80 to kind of get that effect. So we've got that working at the moment, and I think for the most part that's going to be alright initially. But I want this to obviously look like an actual explosion, which means I need to set this up to actually have some nice coloring that really kind of, stands out when it goes off. So at the moment our color of life is set up to be a color of, here we go, to be a color of white and a color of white. However, what I actually want to do is I want it to start off with a fierce color and then push out to like a slightly more white out color. So under output, I'm going to set the 0 point, which is the very beginning, and you know this because it says the in value is 0. I'm going to set this to be 150 on the red axis and 50 and 20. And we get that burst there. Now at the moment it's fading back to white. It's up to you what you want to fade it back to. If I wanted to, I could still have it kind of keeping a red. If I wanted to, I could kind of ending blue somehow. Keep in mind that your alpha is also kicking in as this is working, so it's going to be fading the effects out generally at the same time. But I could go that, for instance, to kind of get more of a whiteout effect. I think in this instance what I really want to do though is I'm going to go similar to the initial effect that we have. However, I'm going to actually start it off less red initially and have more blue. So it's kind of a white initial burst and then pushing out from there. It's up to you how you want to do this. Either way it'll look reasonable. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add some constant acceleration. So if I look at this, I can see that they're exploding out and it's coming out in a flat line. But I think this is going to look a lot nicer if over time they're actually falling. So if I was to right click here and I was to add acceleration, constant acceleration, and set that to be on the x-axis downwards, you can see that we're now grabbing a constant acceleration that's pushing them all downwards, which looks nice too. So if I go here, we've got ourselves a rather nice impulse that can serve as our explosion. Some other things that we could do too are collision with scene depth. So we could make sure that when something does collide with the scene, it has kind of a nice effect. I think in this situation, the defaults are fine. We just want the particles to kind of bounce as they go off. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up size by life. So size by life lets us scale the particles for as long as they're alive. So I'm going to go to here and I'm going to go size by life, and I'm going to get this, which at the moment is a constant curve, which is what we want. And I want to say up until say 60% of your life, I want you to be at a full scale. However, by the time you reach 1, I want you to fade out. So now you can see that these particles, as they kind of reach the end of their life, they get significantly smaller. Do you see that? So that works quite nicely. And it kind of makes me want to go back and change the color of a life a little bit to go to orange a lot quicker. So it's white for the very first hot flash. Well, a blue for the very first hot flash. And then very quickly pushes into there. Now for the lifetime, I'm going to tinker with that just a little bit. At the moment they all last 1 second, but I personally don't like having every particle dying off simultaneously. So I'm going to set this to be between a value of 0.25 and 1.5. You can see that some of these last a little bit longer now. Now the final thing that we need to change on this before we continue is at the moment this is continuously looping. So see how it's just going again and again and again. We don't want that. When an explosion triggers, we want it to just explode one time. So I'm going to go to required, and under duration, there's this section that says emitter loops, and I'm just going to set that to 1. And you'll notice now that it gives me a little word down the bottom that says completed when the effect has completely finished. So this is going reasonably well. The only other thing that I can think of that I might want to do, in fact I definitely do want to do, is the bounding box. So if I click on the black background, it's going to give me the particle system's properties. And I'm essentially going to create a box that the computer knows about that is going to encompass the effect. Now the reason we have to do this is because it's a GPU particle rather than a CPU particle. It doesn't actually know where they're ending up because they're all just being calculated on the GPU. So by doing -600, -600, -600, and 600, 600, 600, it creates a static box that the CPU knows that it can look for to determine whether this effect would still be visible or not. So now that we've got our explosion created, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the next section, which is going to be the flight particle. So this is going to be the particle of the projectile as it's moving through the air. Now to do this, I'm going to actually base it off of what we have going on here, because there's no point in me doing the same thing twice. Now there's a couple of ways I could do this, but first off I'm actually going to show you how to export particles. So I'm going to create a new called p_flight. Now let's pretend I wanted to move something from this particle system into this particle system. There's a nice little feature in Unreal that a lot of people don't know about, that if I go to my content browser, I select the system that I want to copy to. Now in this, if I right click, I can actually export emitter. So emitter, export emitter. And now if I close impulse and I go to my flight particle, you'll see that it's actually copied that in there for me. So in this situation, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this one because I don't need it. I'm going to go to required and I'm going to switch that around to have 0 for the loops. And instead of it being a burst, I'm going to remove the burst and I'm going to set this to be a constant rate of 50. Now we want these particles actually kind of forming a ball that's going to be moving around the world. And there's a nice little system we can do to kind of get that working nicely. We can go to here and we can actually add point gravity to the object itself. So what that means is we're actually attracting it. It's under attraction point gravity. We can set this up to actually have a distance that they all get pulled back into. So I'm going to set the radius up to be 500. Position is 0. And strength is the important one. Watch what happens if I have a very high strength. So that's actually gone ahead and created a nice little orb for us. And if I go view and I enable motion, this simulates what happens as this particle was moving around the world. So that's kind of cool. I actually think that I want to turn the spawn rate up even higher though. Cool. So we'll see how this works. One other nice way to kind of treat these kind of particles when you're testing them is if I go to my content browser and I get my flight effect and I drop it into the world, I'm going to grab it and then hit G. This is how it's going to look as the particle system is moved around the world. I'm going to move it upwards so it's less collision with the world. But so that's what the magic will look like as it approaches someone. We'll kind of get that nice effect. And I think that looks pretty cool. So that's going to be our flight particle system. At the moment, its bounding box is still going to be unset because we copied this from the old system into the new one. So once again, I'm going to go to here and I'm just going to set relative bounding box. And I'm going to keep this pretty high because we don't want it to lose the tail at any stage. But I'm going to go 400, negative 400. I think that'll do. And that should be it for our flight particle effects. If you wanted to, you could do some other pretty fancy stuff, like having a core that's always visible and these little sparks are just chasing it. So it's really up to you. To do that, all I would need to do would create another emitter that wasn't GPU based, that kind of sat in the middle as a general core. But I think this will do for the minute. And it's time for us to move on to creating projectiles, which we'll be doing next. In this lesson, we're going to be creating a projectile. So we've already created the flight template and the hit effect, but I want us to have something so that when we right click, it'll throw a projectile at an enemy. So this means the first thing that I want to go ahead and do is go to blueprints, and I'm going to create a new blueprint class. And this is going to be based on a standard actor. And I'm going to call this base projectile, KG. Base projectile will do. Actually, keeping with what we have elsewhere, it should really be KG projectile base. There we go. So, what is this? This is essentially going to be a few things. First off, we're going to have a particle system in there that is going to be the flight template. So the particle system is going to be the, I'm going to call it flight system. This is going to be set to the system that we created called p_flight. And if I click off that, that's what that looks like at the moment. So that's our basic flight template. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up so that we have something that can handle overlaps. Because when this overlaps an enemy, I want it to explode. So I'm going to add some collision, and I'm going to add sphere collision. So this sphere collision that's been added just here is going to be the thing that has to hit the enemy to explode. Now it's up to us how big we want this to be. At the moment that is a 32 radius, which means keep in mind that your diameter is going to be 64. I'm going to crank this all the way up to 50 though, because I want it to be kind of hard to miss, a little bit more forgiving. And if I scroll down, I'm going to set this up with a couple of extra options. First off, at the moment it's set to overlap all dynamic, but that's not actually what I want. Now, I want it to overlap the pawn and I want it to block everything else. Because when it overlaps the pawn, I'm going to set that up to explode. But when it hits static geometry in the world, such as a wall or potentially a sword if we wanted to get into it, I don't want it to explode. Instead, in those instances, I want it to bounce. But how do we make it bounce, you ask? I'll show you. We're going to add projectile movement. So in the projectile movement component, we can actually set up all of the movement for a standard projectile, including some really cool stuff like homing. See this option down here is homing projectile? We can actually set this up to home in on something if we wanted to. Now I'm going to set the initial speed up as a reasonably high value of 4,000. Max speed I'm going to leave to 0, which means that there's no limit. Now if this was a missile or something like that, I would probably set this option called rotation follows velocity, which would automatically orient the projectile in the direction that it's currently moving in. So if it was a missile, it would always kind of face the forwards. So that's set up. I'm going to keep gravity scale of 1 for the time being. And the last thing I'm going to do before I continue is I'm going to get the sphere and I'm going to make it the root component by just dragging it onto it. Now, we've got the basic setup for a projectile here. And if I was to click the simulate button, we could watch what it would do in a game. So that's how it would look when it flew off, which is pretty cool. So we've got our basic projectile. We know that it's going to fire off and that that's all set up. So the next thing for us to do is to actually add in the functionality that will allow us to fire this at someone. The last thing I'm going to do to this projectile before we continue is also enable bouncing. Now there's this little option here that says should bounce. So I'm going to check that and make sure that the projectile is going to, kind of bounce around before it's done. And finally, I'm going to set the bounciness here. We can actually set up whether we want it to be fully bouncy or if we want it to lose a bit of velocity as it does it. I personally like to have this set to a reasonably high number. So 1 means no velocity has been lost. So I typically like it to be like 0.8, 0.9. And the other thing that I'm going to change here is I'm going to make sure that this projectile can only ever survive for a certain amount of time. And the reason for that is that you don't want your projectiles just lasting forever if they don't ever hit anyone. So I'm going to go to class defaults, and under actor you'll see this little option that says initial lifespan. So 0 means forever, and instead I'm going to set this to 5 seconds, which is also a pretty long time, and that'll be that. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and give my player the ability to throw projectiles. We've created a projectile now, and we've got a character. So it's time for us to actually hook this up to have the ability to throw projectiles. Now I'm going to open up my character base, and I'm going to go to that stub we created a long time ago called Try Magic. Now what Try Magic is going to do is it's going to try to create a projectile that we can throw at someone. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check, are we flinching? So I'm going to go branch, I'm going to set this up, and if we're flinching, we don't want to do anything. If we're not flinching, then we want to throw it. So how are we going to do this? Well, if I go spawn actor from class, I can create projectile. Now, as a quick test, I'm just going to rig this up and see how it goes. So the first thing that we're going to look at is this spawn transform. So this spawn transform refers to where it's going to get created from. Now this is an interesting issue because we need to make sure that we're actually throwing the projectile out of the player. So it's kind of like being propelled away from us and from a good position. Now for the time being, what I'm going to do for testing is I'm going to get a position that is in front of the player. So I'm just going to add an arrow component and I'm going to drag this up and just place it here. Compile, save, and I'm going to go back to my event graph and I'm just going to get the arrow, which again is just a temporary measure, and I'm going to get the world transform and set that up as the spawn transform for this actor. Compile, save. Now, if I was to go into the world and just right click, I'm not getting any functionality out of it. Now the reason I'm not getting any functionality out of it is that I'm going to go to input. I can see that magic attack has been bound to right mouse button, but I'm going to follow this logic through and I'm going to go to the player controller base. And if I look in here, we've currently set up events for melee attack, but not magic attack. So I'm going to copy what I have here, duplicate it with Control W, and all I'm going to do here is, instead of calling try and melee, I'm going to call try magic. And there we have it. I'm now throwing magic out of it. And that magic is then bouncing around the world and acting kind of dangerous. And it exists for 5 seconds. Now, the thing that our magic is currently not doing is I can't actually hit anyone with it. Okay? So, it's time for us to go through and add the functionality that would allow it to explode when it hits a pawn. So I'm going to go to my event graph in my projectile base, and I'm going to start setting this up so that when it hits a player, it'll actually explode. So to do this, what I'm going to do is on overlap, I'm going to cast to character. Whoops. Cast to, now not just any character, but the character base. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to see if this is the instigator. Now I haven't actually set the instigator up yet. So back in character base, I'm going to get this little variable that says instigator and just get a reference to myself. This tells the projectile that the person that created it is me. Now, next up, I'm going to go here and I'm just going to see if this is equal to get instigator. Now, if this is equal to the instigator, so if it's overlapping me, then I don't want it to explode. I want this magic to be only hurting enemies. If we want to, I could get rid of this check and we could set some other stuff up, but for the time being, I'm just going to set it up to only hurt enemies. Now we've done that, so the next thing for us to set up is we want to then go, okay, well we know it's not us, but we are still overlapping a pawn. So instead, I'm going to go to damage. And you can see that we have the apply damage function. And we're going to go off of this in the exact same way that we did before, whereby if this is false, we're going to apply damage, and the instigator is going to be the controller of the pawn that we're referencing. So if I get my pawn reference from this, I'm going to now go controller, and I'm going to get controller and connect that to there. Now the damage causer is going to be a reference to self, and the base damage that we're going to deal when we hit someone with magic, for the time being, I'm just going to set it to 50. Now the last thing that I'm going to do is set up the destroy function. So at the moment, I could just play the effect and then destroy it. It's really up to us as to whether we want the projectiles to always explode in like a fiery ball, or if when they don't hit anything, we want them to just disappear. Now, if we do want them to explode, then I might as well get event destroyed and set this up so that when it's destroyed, it's play, spawn location. Spawn emitter at location, spawns at actor location, so it's spawning where we are, and the thing that it's spawning is the impulse. So I could set that up, which means that after I apply damage, If I then just destroy myself, so destroy actor, it'll now play this. So if I throw that around, I need to get into a place that I'm going to still see it in 5 seconds time. There you go. So you saw it explode in the corner just then. So we know that that's working. And if I was to go here, you can see that when I right click at the player, it's actually dealing damage to her. So we actually had just created an attack that was working and fully functional, and I'm able to throw it, and they'll actually detonate after 5 seconds of life. Now that I think about it, 5 seconds was probably excessive. So that's it for the basics of getting a projectile together. It's time for us to now go out and set up a spawner that's going to keep players coming at us. So we've set up the basics of our magic effect, but it's time we actually tie this in with some anim montages and make sure it's not going to conflict with anything else that's going on in the game. So the first part of that is going to be the anim montage itself. I'm now going to go to Content Browser, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to create a new anim montage based on, there's player shoot, which is the firing effect itself, at which point we also have magic switch. So I'm going to create it off of magic switch, and I'm just going to call this magic shoot montage. Okay. Now this initially shows her doing this. So if I hit play, she's going to do that. Now I'm going to set this to be upper body only. And if you look at it, so she goes down and she does this, at which point we want to set it up so that her hand does the firing animation next. So that's going to go magic, sorry, not magic, you can type in the word shoot, and you'll see we have player shoot. So I'm going to drop that in. And if I watch these two, she's now currently doing that. So she's jumping between them. But it's okay, we can fix that up. So what we're going to do to fix this up and hide that little jot there is, it's super obvious to us from here, but if you look at it from this distance, it's slightly less observable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be playing a fire effect, which is something we haven't done yet. So as this goes off, I'm going to play an incredibly bright flash that is the fire effect itself, and that's going to hide this effect going off, as well as being the point where the projectile fires out from within us. So that means that we're going to need to add 2 new effects that we haven't created yet. One of those is going to be the initial burst coming from our hand, and the other one of those is going to be the charge up effect that we would play during this period. That warns players of what we're about to do. So with that in mind, let's quickly just put together some effects. I'm going to go back to my effects, and for the time being, I'm actually going to use my flight as a base, except I'm going to call this P_fire. So we want this to be a large impulse that comes out of our hand and is a one-time thing. So I'm going to get this, and I'm going to go spawn, and I'm going to set this to 0 on the rate, and once again add a burst list. Under required, I'm going to tell this I don't want it to loop, so it's a one-time thing. So that's good. The next thing I'm going to do is I want this to face down the x-axis, so that when we're aligning it later, it's going to be a bit easier. So I'm actually going to turn Z on both of these again, and this time I'm going to turn off the y-axis. Oh wait, sorry, I want to turn off the x-axis because I want it facing down. There we go. So Y is on, X is off. So we've got this now, and this is going to be our initial kind of flash. I'm also going to set the lifetime of these particles to be significantly shorter. Now it's working reasonably well. The final little touch I'll put on here is I'm actually going to create a new particle emitter that's going to spawn 0 as far as the rate's concerned. It's just going to have a burst of 1 particle, and that particle is actually going to be kind of a cheeky one. I'm going to get rid of this initial velocity, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to spawn a single particle that's very large. Okay. And it's going to be uniform, so it's going to be about 500. I could probably actually go 250. Yep, I'm going to set this to be a simple spot. I'm going to set the required to only loop one time. Lifetime is going to be very short, 0.2. So you can see it popping in. And then I'm also going to set this up to have a color over life. That's going to make it, actually I'm just going to steal the existing color over life that we have there. That way it's the same brightness. And the final part of this is going to be, so when we play it, that's going to do that right now. The final part of this is going to be going to size by life. And I'm going to set this up